A black maid at a secluded estate notices that the aging billionaire she serves is not recovering as he should from a recent surgery. She voices her concerns, but her warnings are dismissed by everyone. When his condition suddenly worsens, she ignores the warnings of the skeptical staff and calls for help, earning only the butler's ridicule. But as the full scope of the emergency unfolds, the woman they wrote off will become the only person who truly matters. Before we get into this story, I'm curious. Where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The Halbridge estate stood veiled behind gates of wrought iron and a long winding gravel drive canopied by ancient oaks. From a distance, it appeared as a relic of a bygone era, a colonial manor with ivy clinging to its stone columns and tall windows mirroring the overcast Boston sky. Yet inside, the atmosphere was far colder than the weather suggested. Not in temperature but in spirit. A silence that spoke of power and buried secrets, of lives that once blazed with fire, now reduced to a faint, flickering ember. Amani Brooks moved silently through the east corridor, her shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rugs. In one arm she cradled a stack of fresh bed linens, her other hand lightly touching the polished wood paneling to steady her steps. Every inch of the Halbridge estate was flawless. The floors shone, the chandeliers glimmered even on sunless days, and the antique furniture stood like motionless guards, immune to the passage of time. But despite all this perfection, a sense of confinement permeated the air. She stopped at the door to Julian Halbridge's suite, taking a shallow breath before a single soft knock, then entering. The air was a blend of lavender and sterile antiseptic. A low fire crackled in the hearth, not for comfort but out of necessity. The man she was assigned to care for sat with his back to her, facing the window in a high-backed wheelchair, his outline faint against the weak sunlight. Once the formidable leader of Halbridge Industries, Julian had commanded empires with the sheer force of his voice. Now that same voice was little more than a whisper. Amani moved with practiced ease, placing the linens at the foot of the bed. Her uniform was starched, her hair neatly bound. She knew her role: speak only when spoken to, no small talk, no personal questions. But she had keen eyes, and what she had been seeing lately had begun to trouble her. Julian's once powerful frame had grown alarmingly frail. His hands trembled when he reached for the teacup the butler left each morning. A faint blue hue had begun to color the skin around his lips, and a quiet moan sometimes escaped him when he shifted in his chair. The others brushed it aside. His doctor called it post-surgical fatigue, a normal symptom for a man his age. The chef saw it as old man fussiness, and the butler simply smoothed Julian's robe and told reassuring stories of his swift recovery. But Amani knew what healing looked like and what it didn't. She had seen stitches before. She'd sat beside hospital beds more times than she wanted to count, gripping her younger brother's hand as monitors hummed around them. Today, as she pulled back the heavy comforter and peeled off the used sheets, something caught her eye. Julian shifted in his chair, a hand reaching to adjust the thick collar of his cashmere robe. For just a moment, a dark, dull red stain, the size of a quarter, appeared near his upper chest, almost invisible against the soft brown fabric. It wasn't fresh or vivid. It was slow, dried at the edges. Amani froze, her gaze fixed on the spot. She didn't speak right away. She first busied herself adjusting his pillows, making sure he was settled. Then, in a low but steady voice, she said, "Sir, I believe there's a stain on your robe." Julian turned his head slightly, the movement seeming to require immense effort. "Oh," he murmured, glancing down with detached indifference. "Just a bit of dried blood. They said that could happen with the old stitches. Nothing to worry about." He waved a dismissive hand, turning back toward the window as if the matter were closed. But Amani didn't move. She stared at the faint mark, her stomach churning with unease. "It's not just dried blood," she wanted to say. "You're not healing, you're bleeding." But the words stayed trapped in her throat. She finished changing the sheets, her fingers trembling slightly as she tucked them in. That night, in the small servant's room down the hall, she lay on her thin mattress and stared at the web of cracks on the ceiling. Rain tapped against the window pane, and the old house groaned with every passing gust of wind. In her mind she replayed the image of that red stain. She couldn't shake the feeling that his trembling hand and shallow breaths were a sign of something much more serious. Something was deeply wrong. She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket tighter, but the chill wasn't in the air. It was a cold, gnawing dread inside her. A voice whispered that she might be the only person who saw what was happening, the only one who cared to. After all, he was just another wealthy, old man with a private doctor and a staff trained to paper over any imperfection. Yet she couldn't escape the cold knowledge that everyone around him had confused silence for stability, and that she might be the only one who hadn't. In the morning she would go back to that room. She would bring his tea and plump his pillows. She would join the pretense that all was well. But tonight, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Amani Brooks made a silent vow. She would watch him more closely than ever. She would not let that red stain grow without knowing exactly what it meant. The night dragged on in Amani's small room. The long yellowed cracks on the ceiling looked like tired branches reaching for nothing. Rain beat a steady, quiet rhythm against the window, mirroring the relentless thoughts swirling in her mind. She pulled the blanket tighter, her eyes wide open in the dark. She had seen it clearly. The stain had deepened against the brown robe like a silent warning. She hadn't imagined it. It wasn't a trick of the light. Maybe no one else had noticed, or maybe they had simply chosen to ignore it. But she had seen it, and the image had nested in her thoughts, refusing to let go. She turned to face the pale blue wall. Her mind drifted back to another hospital room years ago, a place far from this grand estate. Her younger brother, Marcus, had been 13 when he underwent heart valve surgery. The doctor had called it routine, smiling with the same confident indifference Julian's doctor seemed to wear. But 3 days into his recovery something had gone wrong. Marcus complained of a pain deeper than before, and a strange spot appeared above his bandage. The nurses dismissed it. Healing takes time, they'd said. Bruising is normal. But Amani had seen how his breathing grew shallower, the nervous way his eyes shifted when no one was looking. She remembered standing in that hospital hallway, feeling invisible as adults in white coats walked past. No one listened to the scared teenage girl until Marcus's fever spiked and his chest swelled. Only then did the room fill with a frantic flurry of codes, wires, and shouts. He had barely survived. The weight of that memory still clung to her. The bitter realization that if she had spoken up louder sooner, maybe it wouldn't have gotten so bad. Now, in this stranger's house, steeped in wealth and old pride, that same suffocating pressure returned. "I'm just the maid," she whispered, the words sounding small and foolish in the dark. "It's not my place." But a stronger, deeper voice inside her rose to challenge it. "If no one else sees it, if you don't speak, who will?" The rain persisted, soft and steady. Amani didn't sleep. By morning, the clouds had parted and a dull gray light filtered through her lace curtains. She dressed in her crisp uniform and carried the breakfast tray up the grand staircase without a word to anyone. The house was waking up. Distant footsteps echoed in the halls. The scent of baked bread wafted from the kitchen, and a door creaked open and shut down the west wing. She arrived at Mr. Halbridge's suite, knocking twice before entering. The fire in the hearth was now just a bed of glowing embers. Julian was slouched in his wheelchair, still facing the window, still in the same brown robe, though it hung more loosely on his thin frame today. An untouched cup of tea sat on a table beside him. His breathing was slow and shallow. Amani placed the tray down gently, the silverware clinking softly against the porcelain. Julian didn't turn. "I brought breakfast, sir," she said softly. "Ah," he murmured. "Thank you, Amani." He paused, then took a breath. "Sir, may I ask about the stain on your robe from yesterday?" He exhaled tiredly. "Still worrying about a drop of blood?" Amani stepped closer, her voice firm. "It's not just a drop, sir. I believe it's gotten larger." He let out a brittle, dry chuckle. "Everyone's a doctor these days." "I'm not a doctor," she said carefully. "But I've seen this before. My brother had a surgery once. The wound looked like that just before." The words nearly spilled out too quickly and she stopped herself. Julian turned to her, his eyes narrowed, not in anger but in a weary search. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his voice quieter. "But the doctors say it's fine. Healing takes time." "With respect, sir," she interrupted, her heart pounding. This was a boundary she was not supposed to cross with a man like him, but she couldn't stop. "Healing doesn't spread blood across your chest. It doesn't make you weaker every day." Julian studied her, his mouth a tight line. The fire popped behind them. "You are persistent," he said finally. "I suppose that's why Mrs. Halbridge hired you." "I suppose so," she replied, forcing a breath through her nose. A thin silence stretched between them, heavier than any words. Then without warning, Julian leaned forward with a sudden tearing cough. The sound was sharp and jagged, nothing like his weak murmurs. He reached one trembling hand to his chest just above his collarbone, his fingers splayed over the robe. His body jerked once in the chair, then slumped forward slightly as if he could no longer hold himself upright. "Sir." Amani rushed to his side, her breath catching in her throat. Julian coughed again, this time a wet, ragged sound. She reached for his shoulder and gently straightened him. That's when she saw it. The robe had shifted during his movement, and beneath the fold the dark stain had bloomed, spreading outward like a blot of spilled ink. It was not old blood. It was fresh and worse. It was seeping through in an uneven, pulsing pattern. Amani's hands shook as she hovered near the wound. The faint, metallic scent of iron reached her. Julian looked up at her with great effort, his eyes clouded. "It's nothing," he whispered. But it was everything. He could see it now. His lips were pale, his breath uneven, his posture failing with every second. "No," she said, her voice louder than before. "This isn't healing. It's getting worse." He blinked, and a flicker of something she hadn't seen before appeared in his gaze. Not defiance but pure fear. In that instant, Amani knew she could no longer wait. The line she wasn't supposed to cross had vanished behind her. She reached for the small phone on the side table, her fingers moving fast, her pulse thrumming louder than the crackle of the fire. She no longer cared about her place or permission. She had waited once and almost lost someone she loved. She would not make that mistake again. Amani grabbed the phone with one hand and pressed a folded napkin against Julian's chest with the other. The thick, white fabric was quickly turning a dark, sickening red. She could feel the warmth seeping through, a slow but growing pressure with every breath he struggled to take. The cordless receiver felt slick in her grip as she punched in the emergency extension. Her voice was shaky, but her words were swift. "This is Amani Brooks in Mr. Halbridge's suite. He's bleeding from his surgical site. I need medical assistance immediately." The operator's voice, calm and detached, came through the line like a weight thrown in the wrong direction. "Yes, ma'am. Can you confirm the extent of the bleeding? We'll need to initiate a... There's no time." Amani snapped, her voice suddenly sharp with a newfound authority. "The blood is soaking through. He's turning pale. You need to send someone now." "But I need to log the..." Amani's patience snapped under the weight of urgency. "Send them now. He's fading." She didn't wait for a reply, hanging up the phone with a forceful click. She turned back to Julian. His breathing had become uneven, his chest rising and falling in short, shallow gasps. His head drooped, and his fingers twitched weakly on the armrest. The napkin was now completely soaked. She grabbed another from the tray and pressed it over the first, her hands trembling. "Sir," she said, her voice softer this time. "Can you hear me?" Julian's head bobbed faintly. His eyes were half-lidded and glassy. He murmured something she couldn't understand, just a faint movement of his lips and a whisper of air. Then his body went slack, his chin dropping to his chest, his fingers sliding from the armrest. "No," she whispered, reaching to steady him. "Stay with me. Please." The door burst open, this time with a force that rattled the windows. Mr. Cummings, the butler, stepped inside, his expression tight with disapproval. He took in the scene. The blood, the napkin. Julian slumped in the chair. His eyes narrowed. "What is the meaning of this, Miss Brooks?" he demanded, his voice stiff with authority. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Amani didn't even glance at him. "I called the medical team. He's hemorrhaging." "You called them?" Cummings's tone rose with incredulity. "Without clearance. You've created a panic. This could be a false alarm." "It's not," she snapped, turning to face him fully. Her face was pale, but her voice was unwavering. "Look at him. Do you see the color of his skin? The way he's breathing? This isn't a scare. This is real." Cummings moved forward, his jaw clenched. "You have stepped out of line. We have a procedure. You are not qualified." "If he dies," she cut in, her eyes burning, "will you write that on the procedure too? That we waited? That we hesitated while he bled through his robe?" Cummings faltered, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. Amani turned back to Julian. "Sir," she said again, her voice pleading. Suddenly, the door was thrown open again, this time by Dr. Callahan. A leather medical bag was slung over his shoulder. A nurse followed, wheeling a tray of supplies and already snapping on gloves. Callahan's gaze landed on Julian, then dropped to the spreading stain on his chest. His face went white. "Damn it," he muttered, rushing forward to kneel beside the chair. "He's bleeding internally. This is a rupture." He snapped his fingers at the nurse. "Get the kit open now. Oxygen on standby. We're prepping for immediate transfer." Amani stepped back, her heart pounding. Her hands were sticky with blood. Her uniform, once spotless, was now stained with dark blotches. She stood rooted to the spot, the moment stretching out, everything happening both too fast and too slow. Callahan pulled back the robe and swore under his breath. Sutures failed. The artery beneath it ruptured. If we hadn't gotten here when we did, he didn't need to finish the sentence. The nurse handed him a pressure bandage. He pressed it over the wound and turned to the radio clipped to his belt. "This is Callahan. We need transport to Boston General. Priority 1. Patient is in critical condition. Vitals unstable. ETA to readiness. 5 minutes. Notify the ER." A security guard appeared in the doorway with a stretcher. They worked with practiced precision, lifting Julian gently, securing him with straps and monitors. Amani stood motionless, her hands still clenched, her chest heaving with tight, shallow breaths. Julian was barely conscious, but his eyes fluttered open for a brief moment and met hers. She couldn't speak. He blinked slowly and his lips moved once more, a whisper of air. "Thank you." Then he closed his eyes. They wheeled him out, the nurse holding in 4 bag high above her head. Callahan shouted vitals as they rounded the corner. The hallway echoed with the hurried footsteps and the low whine of the stretcher wheels. Amani remained by the chair, staring down at the blood-soaked napkins, one still clutched in her right hand. Her fingers were numb, her knees weak, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Behind her, the fire hissed, consuming the last of the wood. Cummings stood in the doorway, his face pale and stricken. For the first time there was no reprimand, no mention of protocol, just silence. And in that silence, Amani understood something deeper than fear or grief. She had done the right thing. Even without permission, even without thanks, she had seen a man in danger and acted. As she walked to the window, she watched the flashing lights of the ambulance disappear down the long drive. The rain had stopped and the sky was clearing, but the air still held the lingering scent of thunder. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Amani's skin the moment she entered the double doors of Boston General Hospital. The lobby felt too bright with its polished white floors and humming fluorescent lights. A nurse at the front desk directed her through a maze of quiet hallways. Amani walked with deliberate steps, still in her uniform from the estate. The stains had been scrubbed clean, but she could still feel the phantom texture of dried blood on her fingertips. A heavy weight in her chest refused to lift. She didn't know what to expect. A grim face. A solemn handshake. The polite dismissal she had grown accustomed to. But when the door to room 204 opened, she stopped in the doorway and the air seemed to shift. Julian Halbridge was alive. He was propped up in a reclining hospital bed, dressed in a fresh gown. A faint flush of color had returned to his cheeks. A heart monitor beside him beat with a slow, steady rhythm, the line rising and falling like a peaceful breath. He turned his head when he saw her, and a warmth spread across his face, not the distant expression of a man accustomed to being served, but the quiet recognition of someone who had been truly seen for the first time in a long time. "I was hoping you'd come," Julian said, his voice still thin but steadier than she remembered. His hand, frail but firm, reached out from under the crisp white blanket. Amani stepped forward, hesitated, then took his hand gently. "You shouldn't be sitting up," she said softly, her throat tight. "I shouldn't be breathing," he replied with a weak smile. "But here I am. And that's because of you." Her heart lurched, caught between relief and disbelief. She sat in the chair beside his bed, still holding his hand. The room was quiet save for the hum of machines and the occasional footsteps outside. Julian's eyes, once clouded by exhaustion, were sharp again, though softened by pain. "They told me what happened," he said, not breaking eye contact. Dr. Callahan explained everything. As if summoned, the doctor appeared in the doorway. He stepped in slowly, nodding once at Amani. His white coat was unbuttoned, his sleeves rolled up, and for the first time he looked less like an impenetrable authority figure and more like a man carrying a weight he hadn't prepared for. "I owe you an apology," Callahan said plainly, walking toward the bed. "Both of you." Amani looked up, her fingers still laced with Julian's. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do." He stopped at the foot of the bed and met her gaze. The rupture was in a secondary artery, a small branch near the original incision. The sutures weren't holding. It's rare, but it happens. If it had gone unnoticed for another 6 to 12 hours, the bleeding would have been irreversible. Julian's brow furrowed. "So it wasn't just weakness or fatigue?" Callahan shook his head slowly. "It was silent, deadly internal hemorrhaging. Miss Brooks is the only reason we caught it in time." Amani's eyes dropped to her lap, unsure how to process the weight of that truth. She hadn't acted for thanks or recognition. She had simply seen something no one else had dared to see. Julian squeezed her hand. "You saw me, Amani. Not just the blood or the weakness. You saw me. No one's done that in a long, long time." She looked at him, her eyes welling with tears she had held back earlier. "I just did what anyone should have done." "No," Julian said, shaking his head. "Not anyone. Everyone else looked past it. You looked through it and you didn't flinch." Callahan cleared his throat, offering a final nod before turning to leave. "I'll give you some privacy. He's stable, but he needs rest." Amani stood to let the doctor pass, then sank back into the chair. She looked out the window. The sky had cleared since she'd arrived, sunlight pouring over the old brick buildings and glinting off the cars below. The world kept turning, indifferent and unstoppable. Julian shifted in bed and reached for the side table drawer. His movements were slow but deliberate. He pulled out a worn manila folder and held it out to her. Amani frowned, confused, and took it with both hands. "Open it," he said. She slid a single document halfway out, then froze. The first thing she saw was a deed, then a map, then a photo of a small house nestled by a quiet lake surrounded by trees. Trees that changed color in autumn and held silence in winter. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the rest. "It's in Vermont," Julian said, watching her face. "It was my wife's favorite place. After she passed, I stopped going. I kept it quiet, off the books. But it's peaceful. Honest. Somewhere you could breathe." Amani's voice caught in her throat. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because it's yours." She stared at him, stunned. "What?" "You've spent your life answering to others," he said. "Doing what's expected. Staying invisible. Playing small when you are anything but. You deserve a place that isn't someone else's. A place where you're not just allowed to speak, you're expected to." Amani looked at the folder, then back at him. "I can't accept this. It's too much." "It's not a gift," he said. "It's recognition, and it's long overdue." Tears welled up in her eyes. She shook her head, not in refusal but in disbelief. No one had ever given her something like this. Not out of pity but out of genuine respect. "This is earned," she whispered. "You don't have to do this." "I do," Julian replied. "Because I wouldn't be here if you hadn't stood up when everyone else stayed silent. You reminded me I was still a man worth saving." The heart monitor beeped steadily, filling the silence between them. Sunlight spilled across the floor, catching the edges of the folder in her hands. For the first time in a very long time, Amani Brooks did not feel small. 4 days after the hospital, Amani carried the deed with her like a fragile snowflake balanced on her palm. Real but impossible, beautiful but temporary. She tucked it in her coat pocket, then in her dresser drawer, then back in her coat again, as if the proximity might help her understand it better. Every time she looked at the photo of the house, the weathered shingles, the white porch, the lake framed by golden trees, it felt less like a gift and more like a question she wasn't ready to answer. Julian was persistent, but not in the way she had imagined a man like him would be. He didn't demand or manipulate. He simply looked at her with a quiet certainty that dismantled her hesitation. He had made up his mind and she couldn't find the strength or the reason to argue. In the days that followed, he returned to the estate, thinner and slower but undeniably alive. The halls of Halbridge Estate, once filled with only echoes and formality, now carried the sounds of human life. Julian's recovery became the heartbeat of the house. And though doctors and nurses came and went, there was only one person he asked for by name every morning: Amani. Not Miss Brooks, not the maid. Just Amani. He called her into the drawing room one morning, where sunlight streamed through the stained glass window. He was sitting comfortably in his chair, a soft blanket over his knees and a glint in his eye that hadn't been there in months. "I've spoken to the staff," he said, folding his hands. "You are no longer a domestic employee here. I want you as my personal care advisor. Full-time, a formal title, compensation equal to a medical assistant's rate, benefits, autonomy." He blinked, stunned. "You don't need to do that. I was just—" "No," he interrupted gently. "You weren't just anything. You saved my life. You didn't hesitate when everyone else did. That is a kind of intelligence you won't find in any textbook. I want you by my side not because I owe you but because I trust you." And so, for the first time in her life, Amani Brooks accepted a role not beneath someone but beside them, not in the shadows but in the light. 2 weeks later, on a crisp October afternoon, the garden behind the Halbridge estate came alive with soft music, murmured conversations and the gentle clinking of glasses. The ivy on the old brick walls had turned amber and deep red. Strings of lights floated over the gathering, and a long table under the gazebo was set with care. It was a modest affair by estate standards, no press, no grandeur, just those who mattered. Julian insisted on standing despite his doctor's warnings, leaning slightly on a polished cane. His voice, when it rose above the hum of the crowd, still carried the presence of the man who had once commanded boardrooms. "Thank you all for coming," he began, lifting his glass. "I won't bore you with the details of my medical adventure. But I will say this. There was a moment not long ago when I almost didn't come home. A moment when the silence in my chest almost became permanent." He turned slowly to his right where Amani stood. She was dressed simply but elegantly, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Her eyes glistened but remained steady. "And in that moment," Julian continued, "when everyone else dismissed the warning signs, one person refused to look away. One person saw me, not the old man, not the patient, not the powerful name, but the human being. Amani Brooks." Applause rose slowly but sincerely, echoing between the hedges and the ancient stone fountain. Amani stood there, not needing to speak because everything had already been said. That night, long after the last guest had left, Amani stood alone in the guest suite she no longer cleaned but now inhabited. She packed a small bag and placed the Vermont deed on top, smoothing it with one hand. The next morning she drove north. The road unspooled before her, narrow and lined with trees losing their leaves in slow, golden showers. It was a cool, crisp day, bright enough for hope. When she pulled into the gravel driveway of the lakeside house, a gentle wind stirred the surface of the water. A few ducks bobbed near the reeds, unbothered by her presence. She unlocked the front door with a soft click and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, but it welcomed her as if it had been waiting. The wooden floors creaked under her boots. 2 chairs sat by the window facing the lake. She sat in one, folding her hands in her lap. Outside, leaves fell in slow spirals. A loon called in the distance. The water reflected the sky like a mirror no one had yet cracked. Amani Brooks, once invisible and unheard, once taught to stay in the shadows, now watched the world unfold from a place that was entirely her own. She had chosen not to be loud or to fight for recognition, but to speak when it mattered and to act when it counted. And that had made all the difference. As she sat by the window, the light warming her cheek, she closed her eyes for a moment and let the silence in. This time it didn't feel empty. It felt like home. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.